It's the 2013 Boston Marathon, and you're on the last mile of your race when suddenly, boom.
On April 15th, 2013, near the finish line of the Boston Marathon.
2 bombs have exploded in the heart of Boston, and the city is in a state of emergency.
You, coming from Oregon, have nowhere to take refuge. In fact, you're stranded in the middle of a disaster.
Thankfully, you paid attention to this video because you remember that people living in racially diverse neighborhoods are far more likely to offer aid to a complete stranger such as yourself. That is the basis of this study. In 2018, a team of researchers conducted a 5-part study that found a strong correlation between neighborhood racial diversity and prosocial communication, intentions, and behavior.
How exactly did researchers find this to be true? Let's take a look.
The first study tests the correlation between neighborhood racial diversity and prosocial everyday language. Prosocial behavior is a term used in the psychology community to describe empathetic and altruistic human behavior. In this study, racial diversity is measured using Simpson's formula, which compares how equally the 7 distinguished racial groups are represented in a particular population. In a perfectly homogeneous neighborhood, everybody would belong to the same race, and in a perfectly diverse neighborhood, each race would account for 1/7 of all people. Over 30 days, researchers collected 61 million Twitter posts from 200 of the most populated metropolitan areas in the United States. Researchers concluded that 8.6% of all tweets contain prosocial messages. Researchers then traced each tweet back to its owner's zip code to isolate the impact of neighborhood-specific racial diversity. In the end, researchers found that 4.4% increases in racial diversity actually corresponded to a 6.2% increase in prosocial tweets. To validate the significance of racial diversity, researchers repeated this process for other forms of diversity, like gender, political, religious, or socioeconomic diversity. What they found was that not all diversity related to prosocial language, but that racial diversity does. While Study 1 focused on prosocial communication patterns, Study 2 tested the prosocial behavior using naturally occurring data from the Boston Marathon. Like you imagined at the beginning of this video, over 3/4 of racers lived in a different state or a different country, so most people were left stranded without a safe place to go. Now, if you live just outside of Boston, would you have gone out of your way to help in such a vulnerable situation? Well, this study sought to understand who was willing to lend a hand to a stranger, and specifically, were people living in more racially diverse neighborhoods more likely to volunteer support? After the bombing, the Boston Globe newspaper hosted a website that brought in over 3,500 usable help offers within 100 miles of the bombing. In the study, researchers measured prosociality as a percentage of households who offered help in each zip code. What researchers found is that people are twice as likely to volunteer help for every 25% increase in racial diversity. Study 3 verified the findings of Studies 1 and 2 in that they have a cause-effect relationship. Researchers were concerned that prosocial people may have decided to live in neighborhoods that were diverse rather than being prosocial because of living in a diverse neighborhood. The reason the international scale controls for this variable is that immigrants compose of only 3.2% of the world's population, which means most people don't choose where to live on an international scale, whereas they might on a neighborhood scale. This study utilized data from the World Giving Index 2012 survey, where over 150,000 people from 128 different countries responded yes or no to the following question. In the past month, have you helped a stranger or someone you did not know who needed help? This is the same question that people in Boston asked themselves after the bombing. Am I willing to help a stranger? The study found that for every 25% increase in diversity corresponded to a 2.5% increase in likelihood of helping a stranger. Even though this is a relatively small change, it is still statistically significant enough to reaffirm the findings of Studies 1 and 2. In Studies 1 through 3, researchers found a positive relationship between living in a diverse neighborhood and helping. However, in Study 4, researchers found that the relationship was more precisely explained after taking into account identification with all of humanity as a mediating variable. Through a 500-person survey, researchers tested prosociality with 1 question about helping strangers in the last month and 10 questions that compared identification with one's own community, identification with Americans, and identification with all of humanity. Researchers first tested a direct connection between diversity and helping as a control. Then, researchers tested their hypothesis through the mediating variable, identification with all of humanity. Researchers found that for every 50% increase in neighborhood diversity results in a 126% increase in helping. What this means in the context of the whole study is that by introducing identification with all of humanity as a mediating variable, they discovered a crucial link between neighborhood racial diversity and prosociality, which solidified the previous findings. While studies 1 through 4 each tested the correlational relationship between neighborhood racial diversity and prosociality, Study 5 directly simulates how these variables might impact human thought patterns. In an online survey, participants imagined that a bomb had exploded in a close-by city and that they lived among a row of houses in a generic US suburb. Then, participants were randomly assigned to either a homogeneous neighborhood of European Americans or a racially diverse neighborhood. Participants rated their likelihood of providing shelter, transportation, or food to the victims. Using the same mediating variable of identification with all of humanity as in Study 4, researchers found that participants who imagined living in a racially diverse neighborhood reported a greater willingness to help people than people who imagined a homogeneous neighborhood. In fact, for every 27% increase in imagined racial diversity, we can expect a 16% increase in likelihood to help a stranger compared to imagining a homogeneous neighborhood. To summarize these findings, Study 1 and 2 measured prosocial communication and behavior, Study 3 validated these findings on an international scale, Study 4 identified a mediating variable, and Study 5 ties all the studies together through an imaginative simulation. As architects, planners, and policymakers, this research could not be more relevant. This knowledge empowers us to design built environments that positively impact our prosocial attitudes and behaviors towards other people.